Welcome to Toxicology Basics. A little bit more information or a little bit more conceptual skills that you'll need for the AP Environmental Science exam as well as our labs. I want to start with reviewing what we've talked about already. We know that toxins exist, that basically anything can be toxic at a certain level, and a lot of times we're trying to figure out how much of that substance would result in sort of bad effects or even death. So that's kind of the study of toxicology. And we use a couple different units to measure how much of a substance could be toxic. We use parts per million, which how many of it are in 1 million parts of a whole. For example, how many of it exists and how many toxic chemicals exist in a million cubic centimeters of ocean water. So we're talking about concentrations that are very small because chemicals can actually have an effect, some of them at very dilute concentrations. We could even have to be as dilute as using parts per billion. How much of that toxin is in a billion cubic centimeters of ocean water, or even parts per trillion. Each of these is like a quantity per quantity measure. They are in comparison to how much of the whole you have. How many of those smaller parts exist within the whole. So for example, let's think of a cube. This could be of ocean water, this could be of air where toxins exist. Think of a cube with 1 meter on each side. Answer me this. If it's 1 meter on each side, how many centimeters is that? So basically, how many centimeters are in 1 meter? Come on, people. Carolina, do you know? How many centimeters are in 1 meter? Yeah, that's right. There's 100 centimeters in 1 meter. So it's 100 centimeters tall, 100 wide, 100 back. My question for you is, how many cubic centimeters exist within this cube? How many little cubes with a centimeter on each side could I fit inside here? Could I stack up to equal this cube? How many cubic centimeters are in this? So we're going to use a little math, Sebastian. I want you to pause this video for a second and try to calculate that. How many cubic centimeters are in this cubic meter box? Well, I hope you got that. This actually makes 1 million cubes. And the reason I'm having you calculate that is because it's showing you what part per million would be. A part per million, 1 ppm, 1 part per million, would be 1 teeny tiny cubic centimeter within this huge cube. So there's actually 1 million of them. There's actually 1 million of them that could fit in that area. So that's going to give you 1 million, what we call cubic centimeters. Centimeter would be a cubic centimeter on each side. 1 block, 1 part per million. There it is. So take a look at what 1 part per million means. When you look at this, you can get a sense of what 1 part per million is. So if I say 1 part per million, an example of that would be 1 inch in 16 miles. So that 1 inch represents 1 part of the whole, 1 millionth part of the whole, and the whole is 16 miles. Or we could represent it 1 minute in 2 years. So this minute that we're living in right now is 1 part per million of your life for the next 2 years. Or 1 cent in $10,000. 1 ounce of salt in 31 tons of potato chips. Or 1 bad apple in 2,000 barrels of apples. So this is just some comparisons for you to understand what 1 part per million is. Now take a second and try to brainstorm what one part per billion could be. 1 part per billion, okay? If we want to figure out what 1 part per billion is, we need to take a 1 centimeter cube. We're taking a 1 cubic centimeter block, and we're going to cut that into 1,000 blocks to give us 1 part per billion. 0.1 centimeter by 0.1 centimeter by 0.1 centimeter would be 1 block, or one part per billion of this, and that would give us 1/1000th of centimeter cubed. So what I've done is I've taken this cube out of our original block. Do you remember our original block? Here we go. Let's go back. Here's our original block, 100 centimeters on each side. I've taken this cube right here and blown it up on this next slide. Just a second. On this slide. So I've taken this whole cube was just that little one we were looking at. Now I'm cutting that into 1,000 blocks. So that's going to give me what will represent 1 part per billion, 1/1000th of a cubic centimeter. 1 out of 1,000th of a cubic centimeter. So 1 part per billion is much, much smaller. It's not 1 inch in 16 miles. It's 1 inch in 16,000 miles. Try to really comprehend how small that is. 1 part per billion is not very much. Or 1 second in 32 years. This 1 second out of the next 32 years of your life. 1 cent in $10 million. 1 pinch of salt and 10 tons of potato chips. And so on and so forth. Okay. So now let's try to get a sense of 1 part per trillion. So I'm going to take 1 of the part per billionth box and divide that by 1,000 again. So it's going to be only 100th of a centimeter on each side, and that's going to give me 1 part per trillion, or 1 millionth. 1 millionth of a cubic centimeter would be 1 part per trillion. That's really quite an incredibly small quantity. It would be 1 postage stamp in the area of the city of Dallas, or 1 inch in 16 million miles. That's more than 600 times around the earth. 1 second in 320 centuries. This second we're living in now is not even a trillionth of your life. You don't even have enough years in your life to do that. 1 flea and 360 million elephants, etc., etc. 1 part per trillion is incredibly small. So it's really important to remember that when we're talking about things to the left side of the decimal point, like things that you think of in the normal number range, 1 trillion is really, really big. 1 billion is bigger than 1 million, but definitely less than 1 trillion, and 1 million would be the smallest. But we're talking about quantities that are on the right side of the decimal point. 1 part per trillion is the smallest. 1 part per trillion is the smallest. 1 part per billion is in the middle, and 1 part per million is actually the largest of those, because things get smaller as you move to the right side of the decimal point. So, and also another important relationship to remember is equivalent units. So for normal conditions, for standard temperature and pressure on the surface of the earth, under normal conditions, 1 cubic centimeter is actually equal to 1 milliliter. And that's equal to 1 gram. So you can use all of these interchangeably. What I mean is on the AP exam, you might see 1 cubic centimeter. That's the same thing as 1 milliliter. They're equal quantities. And 1 milliliter is the same thing as 1 gram, when we're talking about water, of course. And these are all equal quantities. So you could see them written out in any way here. Now, if the temperature changes or the pressure changes, these volumes can expand, and they will no longer be equal. But normally, these are equal measurements for water. That means that there's a bunch of different ways we can think about parts per million. Okay, so 1,000 milliliters is the same thing as 1,000 cubic centimeters, is the same thing as a liter of water, is the same thing as 1 kilogram, is the same thing as 1,000 grams. So all these quantities listed here are equal. Milliliters, cubic centimeters, that liter, kilogram, grams. Okay, so when we talk about 1/1000th of a gram, we're talking about 1 part per million, or we could say 1 milligram per kilogram, or we could say 1,000 kilograms, 1 in 1,000 kilograms. So this is 1 part per million. Same is true, you could replace those units with cubic centimeters, millimeters cubed per 1 liter, or you could replace that with milligrams per liter. So all these are just showing equivalent ways of writing the same thing, 1 part per million of water. So when we measure toxicity, we're going to do this in the lab. We're going to do this in the lab. It's determined in the lab. So on the AP exam, don't ever write that toxicity was determined on humans or it was determined in the environment. What we do to test toxicity is we do everything in the laboratory. Okay? The normal procedure is to use test animals, like we're doing in your lab with the brine shrimp. We use test animals and we have them either ingest it or place them in an environment. So we can feed a pill to a rat, for example, or we can make sure that the rat ingests the toxin. We can apply it to the skin, we can inhale it, or we can force some other method to introduce it into the body. And then we place that test material, or we can place that test material in water or air, and test the animal's environment. Now, for a second, think about your brine shrimp lab. Which of these sort of methods, which of these methods are we using for the brine shrimp lab? Which of these methods are we using for the brine shrimp lab? Yes, definitely. We're using this water substance and we're putting some ammonia in it, and we are exposing the brine shrimp to the ammonia by allowing them to live in that for a little bit and introducing it into their bodies. So that's one way in which we measure the toxicity of a substance. So toxicity can be measured in a couple different ways. We can measure how the toxicity level affects death, how many of the organisms are living or dying in different concentrations. We could measure how it affects birth defects, teratogenicity. Carcinogenicity would be ability to cause cancer, and mutagenicity would be to cause changes in DNA. In our brine shrimp lab, which of these are we testing for? Death, birth effects, cancer, DNA. Brine shrimp lab. Yeah, definitely. We're testing the death. Are they living or dying? We don't really know any of these other things, which might be important when we're worried about how they affect humans. So when we use mortality, death, as our endpoint, we measure that with the LD50 or the LC50. Now, we've already talked a little bit about this. We know the lethal dose 50. We've already talked about this in class before. So I would just like you to take a minute right now, pause the video, and write down again, what is the LD50 of a chemical? What is the LD50 of a chemical? Jot down your answer to that question right now. All right, so let's look at that. This would be the lethal dose at 50%. We already know that LD50 is the dose of a chemical that produces death in 50% of a population. So exposing yourself to ingesting this to a certain degree will cause death in about 50% of the test subjects being used. So that would be 1/1000th, the substance times 1/1000th of the body weight. So it's normally expressed in parts per million. How many parts per million will cause death of 50% of the population? But there's something a little bit different when we say the LC50. We're not talking about the dose. We're talking about not the dose, the concentration. The concentration. Now, what's the difference here? Well, the dose, when I'm talking about the LD50, I'm talking about ingesting it, meaning I actually probably put it in my mouth and swallow it. So that would be the dose that I'm receiving of the toxin. But if I'm talking about LC50, I'm talking about the concentration of the toxin in my environment. It could be in the air. It could be the LC, the lethal concentration in the air I'm breathing. Or if I'm an organism that lives in the water, I could be talking about the lethal concentration of a substance living in the water. So the concentration of a chemical in an environment, usually the air or the water, that produces what we talked about before, death in 50% of those exposed. So in our brine shrimp lab, are we really calculating the LD50 or the LC50? In the brine shrimp lab, are we calculating the LD50 or the LC50? Right, we're calculating the LC50 because we're putting the brine shrimp into the water. So we're not actually feeding it to the brine shrimp themselves, although I'm sure they're consuming it by being part of that. Okay, so this is also expressed in parts per million. Okay. So one final thought here before I pause. There are actually 3 routes that you can be exposed: oral, dermal, and inhalation. I think you can make a guess about what these mean. So I'm just going to have you pause here, and on your paper, what do we mean when you're exposed to a pesticide or exposed to a toxin orally, dermally, and inhalation? What do those mean? Okay, oral means what? Right, your mouth. You're actually consuming it. You're putting it in your mouth. Dermal, dermatologist. What does derm mean? Derm means skin. So dermal would be exposure to your skin, probably being absorbed into your body, and then finally